Please take a moment to introduce yourselves in the chat. If you could give your name, what city you're calling in from today, and if you have a question or concern about the budget, please let us know what it is there, or if you just want to let us know what your budget priorities are, that would be great too. We'll be using the chat as we go throughout today's meeting to ask questions of our special guest, Brian Pahnke, who's going to be walking us through the state budget. And feel free at any point to just put your questions in there as they come up. We'll be moderating the chat and letting Brian know if he has questions that need immediate answer, we'll kind of interrupt it so he can cover those for us. Otherwise, we're going to try to hold the questions until the end when we have at least 15 or 20 minutes for a good conversation about the material that he's covered. My name is Heather Dubois-Bournon. Welcome to this event in our Closing the Gaps workshop series, where our aim is to better understand what's at stake in the state budget process for our children and their public schools. We are excited to be moving forward in this work because now that the public hearings for the Joint Finance Committee have been announced, we have a unique opportunity to speak up and make our voices and our concerns heard to our lawmakers, those who serve on that Joint Finance Committee and our own. And we strongly urge you to take advantage of all the opportunities that we've put together, both to speak out and to get better at telling your story. We've got a workshop this Thursday. We'll put the link in the chat so you can sign up, but we're going to be doing a storytelling workshop at 6:30 this Thursday night. And we invite you to come learn a little bit more about how you can put the knowledge that you gained today to use in the service of delivering effective testimony. And then you can show up either in person to deliver that testimony on April 9, 21, or 22. You can try to get in line for that one-day virtual hearing that's going to be held on the 28th, or you can submit your testimony in writing either through the online portal that the Joint Finance Committee has set up or through the email link that they have set up. But if you follow this QR code to our budget headquarters page, you'll find all of that information and much, much more, including after this event, a link to the presentation that Brian's going to make today. So we invite you to take advantage of all of those opportunities, and also to, when you're on our website, to be sure to check out the state superintendent headquarters page so that you can learn more about the candidates for superintendent of public instruction and make an informed decision at the ballot box on April 6th. Early voting has already started for this election, so if you haven't already requested your ballot by mail, you may do so, or you can vote in person early at your local municipality. Also want to point you to one more new resource that we've got on our website. This is our brand new education vote tracker, where you can track the bills that are making the most buzz related to public schools and what's best for kids at the Capitol. So follow this code or visit wisconsonnetwork.org/tracker to see what education bills are up before our state legislature, what groups have lobbied for or against those bills, and after the bills have passed or failed to pass, how your own lawmakers voted on them. So that brings us to today's main event, a budget breakdown with our old friend, Brian Pahnke, who we know well from his days at DPI, where he directed many a budget there. And we are happy to continue to work with him now that he holds the position of state budget director. And we're so appreciative of him for accepting our invitation to walk us through today some of the budget priorities that the governor has put forward and what they mean to our kids in schools. Thank you so much for joining us today, Brian. I am going to stop sharing my screen and hand it over to you.
Thank you, Heather, and thanks everyone for taking the time to be a part of this presentation today. I'm just seeking to make sure I find the right document there. Hopefully it's something everyone can see out there. Again, I want to express my thanks to Heather, Christian, and others for the opportunity to be here today, and certainly on behalf of Governor Evers, Lieutenant Governor Barnes, Secretary Brennan, just for the chance to share for a little bit of time here some of the major items in the governor's K-12 budget and a few others that are part of his juvenile justice initiatives for this audience. Again, the budget process, as always, is an arduous one that began last fall for the governor and concluded at least at one piece here on February 16th, a month ago today, when the governor introduced his biennial budget, again, running from the period from July 1, 2021 through June 30th, 2023. So the next 2 fiscal years for the state of Wisconsin. Also, the state's fiscal years line up with the school years for K-12 schooling. So those line up with the 21-22 school year, 22 and 22-23 school year as well. So when I speak about years, they will be consistent from both a school and state fiscal perspective. As Heather noted, obviously there's lots to do. And before I go through some things, I just want to mention, as she's already noted, the advocacy of the WPN and all of those that comprise it and all the great work that's been done through it, and advocacy is deeply appreciated. As the governor has noted to me personally, he is appreciative of it. We also seek continued advocacy for as many of items as you can choose to support in his budget in the weeks ahead. The Finance Committee will be meeting, as Heather noted, with hearing sessions coming up in about 3+ weeks. It is also possible in the upcoming weeks, we do not know this, whether State Superintendent Stanford Taylor will be called upon to also present her thoughts related to the governor's budget, which we were hopeful she will be quite supportive as well, since so many of them came from her initiatives as well last fall. And then subsequently, it's typically in the month of May. We don't know that for sure, but that is likely when the Joint Committee on Finance will take action as they have in the past in making any changes that they choose to the governor's budget. So just a little bit of background there. And if I'm doing this correctly, hopefully my slides are advancing. Just checking here. There we go. So the first slide I wanted to share here was just sort of a top 10 list, if you will, of general purpose revenue programs. General purpose revenue programs are those supported with all state tax dollars, whether they're income, sales, corporate, what have you. And what I wanted to show here is in terms of the governor's recommendation in the second year of the biennium, kind of where they fall. And as you can see, when you look at the entire state budget, a little bit more than a third of the recommendations in the governor's budget in terms of dollars overall are in the K-12 area, which is by far the largest and actually double the second largest item, which is also quite significant, which is medical assistance. And while I won't go through every single item here, I just want to note the importance of K-12 education. Clearly, in any state's budget for any governor, any legislature, in particular, it is typically the #1 item. And when I speak of K-12 school aids, I speak of both the general school aid formula that's been around for many a year, that distributes aid based on property values of a district and their spending and the number of students, and then categorical aids, which I'll talk about later, with children with disabilities, varsity aid, breakfast aids, monies for transportation purposes and what have you. There are a number of those as well. But I just kind of want to show here, when you look at the state of Wisconsin's budget, and here are the governor's priorities in particular for the second year of the biennium, you can see that 36%, a little bit more than that, of all the recommended dollars he has in the aggregate when you're looking at general purpose revenues. There's other revenues that the state receives. Obviously, federal are a much larger share than ever before. Program revenues that you receive through licensing and other functions, and segregated revenues are also received like through school library aid by districts. But when you look at this total here, you can see where the governor's priorities are. The next slide I just want to show is just aggregate dollars. And this is Governor Evers' budget. This is over the 2-year period. And his proposals here are essentially, if you will, a top 8 list, really a top 7. But just want to show in the aggregate, when you look at his general purpose revenue increases over base funding, in the aggregate, the governor's recommendations are about $3.2 billion new dollars in proposed expenditures between the 2 years. And if you look here closely, and it's been mentioned, I think in a couple of quarters already, that roughly half, actually a little bit more than half, of all the new general purpose dollars that the governor is recommending are at the Department of Public Instruction. So I think that says it all right there, or says quite a bit. Certainly, there are other significant recommendations related to the Department of Health Services for all health programs across the board, hospitals, providers, et cetera. Clearly, there are significant needs that are certainly related to the pandemic and well beyond. In terms of economic development, the governor has a number of proposals here, Department of Children and Families, that I'll talk about briefly at the end. Also, there's significant recommendations there. University of Wisconsin system, I think there was a note there on the chat of someone wanting to know that. The governor's recommendations for the UW system, I believe, are the largest, if not the largest, almost of all time, but certainly in the last couple of decades are just shy of 200 million new state dollars recommended there. Additional recommendations, and I wanted to note this one specifically related to the Public Service Commission. A significant part of that $156 million pertains to the governor's proposals for broadband expansion, which we all know are critical, particularly in the rural areas of our state that are not as connected as they can be, and the importance that doing that will play on behalf of school kids across the state of Wisconsin, and certainly adults as well. The governor, of course, has a number of recommendations, not surprisingly, also related to the Department of Workforce Development. And then when you look at all the other items, and that includes the Department of Administration, the other departments of agriculture, Department of Natural Resources, et cetera, those are the kind of in that last group. So going into the K-12 world specifically, I just kind of broke out this first slide here of big picture items. And I will touch base on each of these categories, if you will, going through this presentation. And this slide essentially shows you what I broke down for the purposes of today, really 4 specific areas, and then a 5th one was kind of an all-in for other categorical aid. And in terms of the general equalization aid recommendation, this is very consistent with what the governor recommended 2 years ago, looking at it over 2 years. And this is the one that's often tied to 2/3 funding. And to be sure, it is a part of the 2/3 funding commitment. I'll talk about that in a bit, but it's not the only part. But overall, the governor's recommending sizable increases, again, that are pretty consistent with what he proposed 2 years ago, totaling a little bit more than $600 million over the biennium for these school aids, which go to nearly every district in Wisconsin. We're all very well aware WPEN has been as stalwart a supporter of increases for children with disabilities as any organization, and I know there are many out there as well that have been. The governor's recommendation here in the aggregate, and I'll talk about this in a little bit more detail, is even larger than he proposed 2 years ago. And I combined a couple of aids here to get to that $720 million figure over 2 years, which, as you can see here, is larger than his proposal in general equalization aids overall. For pupil aids, these are aids that go to every district on a per pupil basis, and it's a little complex this go around, but I wanted to note that the recommendation here is over $60 million. Certainly a priority of the governor's previously as both state superintendent and certainly as governor is providing more support to all of our kids and certainly adults as well. But in terms of those supports that are provided for mental health aids, the governor is standing there right with the state superintendent in making recommendations that total a little bit more than $50 million. The last group, and I'll talk about these at the end, is really all the other recommendations. And certainly if I was doing this, I would need probably a couple hours to go through each of them. And I'll summarize them later, but these include English learner aids, nutrition aids, energy efficiency aids, and some of the other items I will mention, and you can see that in total. When you look at the bottom here, again, the governor's recommendations, a little bit more than $600 million new dollars in the first year for K-12 school aids, a little bit more than $940 million in the second year. These are all fund sources as well. So these numbers differ a little bit than what I already showed you. And you look at it in the aggregate, and the governor's proposal is about $1.55 billion, a little bit more than he proposed even 2 years ago in what was a record number for K-12 education on behalf of any governor or legislature in state history. On the next slide, I'm showing, hopefully everyone can see it, but just kind of a little bit of a narrative slide here on 2/3 funding and state general school aids. As noted here, and consistent with what the governor has recommended both as state superintendent and also as governor in his first budget, also consistent with what the current state superintendent recommended, and that's to provide the necessary state general and categorical aids to achieve the 2/3 funding of the definition that existed. You got to go back a little bit. but it was in place from 1996-97 through 2002-03 for both fiscal years. The current state support level is estimated to be at about 65.2% in the current year. So it's a move up, and every percentage point is a significant move. But it's certainly something the governor has said on multiple occasions. It is also something I will humbly note was noted by the Blue Ribbon Commission on school funding. That was the members of it from a couple of years ago that submitted their recommendations to current Speaker Voss and I guess former Speaker Fitzgerald at the time. So this was a group that was in place in 2017 and I believe in 2018 that met around the state and had a number of recommendations that they forwarded for consideration by the legislature. This was one of them, and we will politely continue to note that to them. I think the governor has already done so. Second item here I wanted to note that's quite significant, as recommended by also by the state superintendent. Due to membership fluctuations currently related to the current pandemic, the governor is recommending right now, there's a current provision, it's been in place for a long time, within the school aid formula. It says you get at least 85%, every district will get at least 85% of what received in the prior year, no matter what else happens. The governor is recommending, consistent with the state superintendent as well, that figure go to 90% for the next 2 years. So no district can see a decline of more than 10% of their school aids, no matter what else happens to them in the school aid formula. And then the last item I just want to mention, which was also something the governor recommended 2 years ago, he's recommending, and this is kind of an add-on to the numbers I've already mentioned, that the state finally buy back the current $75 million general school aids delay that's been in place, I believe, since 1997-98, also quite some time. Since that time, the state has paid school districts $75 million late, something Mr. Soldner and I are quite familiar with from our times at the Department of Public Instruction. And it's just been around for a long time. This recommendation just to pay the state school aids when they should be paid in the current year, it's not only a good thing for the state, it's also a very good thing for school districts. It hopefully would reduce the need for any short-term borrowing. And so the state pays its bills on time. One other small argument I'll always make here is it's something that should have been done some time ago, we think, and the governor's recommending it once again. And I would politely note that the state does not pay, and I don't believe has ever paid any of its aids for the choice programs or the students on vouchers ever late private. On revenue limits on the next slide, a couple of really important pieces here. As always, the governor is recommending providing per pupil adjustments on a full-time equivalent basis, consistent with what he has done before, which is $200 for all students in the first year of the biennium and an additional $204 above that in the second year of the biennium. Now these increases across the board now vary for any given district, but they are still a little bit less than 2%, just on the carrying forward of per pupil adjustments, which have been around since revenue limits were put in place, 27, 28 years ago. And I would note back at the time, that number when it first were put in place was $190 per pupil at that time. These numbers have gone up over time. Unfortunately, under the prior administration and some prior legislatures, they chose not to do them, and they have chosen not to do them going forward, which is the second thing I want to mention here, the dot point, which is saying that these numbers should be put in place permanently and then also indexed going forward with CPI, something the governor's recommended on a number of occasions so that school boards and district officials have some predictability and sustainability going forward, that they know what these numbers are. They were in that mode, if you will, for I think 18 years or 16 years from 93 to 2009, where they were put in place so a district knew even after a budget was done, what they would be in the next couple of years as well. They could count on it. Unfortunately, that's not been the case for the past 10 years. The third item I want to mention is something that the Department of Public Instruction recommended, and that's allowing all school districts to choose the higher of their summer and fall membership counts from 2019 or 2020 for revenue limit purposes for their revenue limit calculations, both next year, I shouldn't say both, all 3 years, 21-22, 22-23, and in 23-24, because the revenue limit calculation is based on a 3-year average. And the recommendation of the governor is, given the significant impact the pandemic has had on school district membership and enrollment, both in the summer and fall, that that districts have that flexibility going into the next budget. The governor, consistent with what he proposed 2 years ago, also is recommending that the legislature consider increasing the 4-year-old kindergarten membership calculation so that those districts that have full day programs 5 days a week can count those students as 1.0, just like every other student gets counted in their cap. Currently, that's only currently the districts, regardless of the number of hours a 4-year-old kindergarten student spends or goes to school, he or she is only counted as a 0.5 or 0.6 FTE under current law. And then lastly, on this page, the governor is recommending increasing the low revenue ceiling, which has been in place, I think, since 1996. And what this is a feature that's been around for quite a while as well, is it says to all districts, you have the ability to move to this figure without having to go to referenda. It's up to the district if they choose to do so. That figure under current law is $10,000 per pupil. The governor is recommending it go up by $250 a pupil in each year successively, and also to exceed the overall adjustment of $200 per pupil. So essentially, those districts that have the lowest revenues, or generally speaking, the lowest expenditures on a per pupil basis, have that opportunity to go up a little bit more without having to go to referenda. And we believe this would be beneficial to probably well over 100 districts. I just put 100 here, but it probably is a bit more than that if they so choose to do that. And I would note this last item the governor had recommended in his last budget, and it's one of the ones specifically that the members of the Joint Committee on Finance move forward. So on categorical aids, I want to talk about special education categorical aids. There are 3 in the current law. I just want to share a bit here on what the governor's recommendations are with each of them. Probably the most well-known one, which is entitled Special Education Aid. You can see the numbers there. It's a little bit less than 710 million over the biennium. And in the italicized language on the far left-hand side of the screen, you can see the governor's recommendation is to increase the state reimbursement rate from what is about 28%. And I want to note that in the current year, according to the Department of Public Instruction, when this provision was put in place 2 years ago, and ultimately the governor had a higher recommendation, but the legislature came back and thought at the time that they had funded 30% of costs in 2020-21. It looks like that number is only going to be about 28%. Now, it's an improvement from what it was, and that's one of the first times that it actually had moved the needle at all in many years. It didn't move at all under the prior administration, but I don't think specifically. But what the governor is proposing now is to move from 28% to 45% in year 1, and then up to 50% in year 2. So those are important pieces there, and that's what those dollars reflect. But also a significant piece here, and I noted on the slide, is the current appropriation is a sum certain. And as I mentioned a minute ago, typically with a sum certain appropriation, you have what you have. And if the number is supposed to hit 30% and it doesn't, that's how it goes. And maybe it only hits 28%. What this would say, if the legislature would be agreeable to it, would be that if the governor says 45% and 50% and they agree to that, that's what the reimbursement rates would be when the Department of Public Instruction awarded those dollars at the end of that fiscal year. They would have the ability, and the state would be authorizing them to have the ability to pay out the amount that would be in the schedule, as opposed to it being prorated at something less, like it is now. Second one here is the what is known as high cost special education aid. This has been around for probably about, I think, 12 or 15 years or so. And this provides districts with reimbursement for costs for educating pupils whose costs would exceed $30,000 in a given year. And the governor's recommendations here, you can see the numbers across the screen. And then in the italics, I note that this would increase the state reimbursement rate for eligible students from what is about 31% right now, according to the Department of Public Instruction, to 40% next year, and then 60% in the following year, based on those eligible costs and the estimates and the assumptions related to them. Certainly an improvement over where we are now. And again, moving up a threshold, if you will, pretty consistent with what the state superintendent recommended. And then the last item here, special education transition grants that have been around more recently. The governor's recommendation is in the second year to help build the base going forward. That's a $1.5 million appropriation that goes to certain districts for certain purposes in working with children with disabilities. The governor's recommending essentially doubling that number in the second year of the biennium. So in the aggregate, you can see the governor's recommendations related to special education categorically here, totaling about $720 million, more than that overall in the biennium. The next item I wanted to mention, their next page, are student mental health categorical aids. I mentioned these early on. There are specifically two, and they've been around for not as long, probably I want to say 6 or 8 years perhaps. And something the governor felt strongly about as state superintendent. Certainly State Superintendent Stanford Saylor, I think, believes the same. And the recommendations here, I believe, are completely consistent with what the state superintendent recommended. The first being for mental health and wellness aid of a little bit, just shy of $50 million over the biennium. And while it's not specifically a reimbursement rate-based program, I note here the reimbursement rates, according to the Department of Public Instruction, it's about, the state share is about 2% now, and this would increase those to about 10% in each of the next 2 years, and also kind of change a little bit how those reimbursement rates are calculated. But certainly a significant improvement here over what's provided now. Again, the governor had some pretty significant recommendations last go around, and I guess the upshot of that was it did move the needle somewhat, but kind of similar to funding for children with disabilities. The recommendations from the Joint Finance Committee and Legislature were pretty short of what the governor recommended, albeit they were increases over what was the current appropriation. And then secondly, with regard to the school-based collaboration grant, providing support to students also seeking mental health services and providing that support that's so necessary for schools across our state, particularly given what's been going on with the pandemic, is providing that additional service, those additional youth with those services, consistent with the state superintendent's recommendation. The governor's recommending $7 million here over the biennium. On per pupil categorical aids, I wanted to note this earlier because this one's a little bit more confusing and it's a little bit of a narrative here. Just want to note here, these have been around for about 10 years. And while they're perhaps, a little bit different than has been done in the past by looking at funding schools through revenue limit authority and then general aids filling in some of the difference there, if you will. These aids go directly to all districts, and they are funded at about $616 million now. They are a sum sufficient, which is rare for public schools. They're $742 per student now. This is the one that the governor vetoed up a year and a half ago. Provide additional support here because we were able to figure a way to do that. And the governor's recommendations here, it's just a couple of steps that I wanted to note here. One is he's proposing repealing the current supplemental per pupil appropriation that would only have gone to a few districts. This one he also struck in his veto, repurposing that $2.5 million each year. So that's about $3 a kid. So kind of funneling all of this into one appropriation. And then basically adding $5 to have this appropriation for all kids be $750 per pupil. And I just kind of show the short math there for all districts in both 21-22 and 22-23. And then above and beyond that, the governor's recommending providing an additional $75 per pupil for each economically disadvantaged pupil in each district. So really you're at, again, really essentially by the 0.1 factor or a 10% factor. So a student who is economically disadvantaged, that student would, according to state law, would receive reimbursed. The district would reimburse $750 specifically for all kids if he or she's economically disadvantaged. And I want to say the population there is about 350,000 kids, if I recall correctly, give or take, in the state. Again, this is in any district, large or small, rural, urban, suburban, what have you. This would be an additional $75 per pupil in both years of the biennium. And then here's the busy table. This is slide 10 at the bottom of the screen, excuse me. These are the additional targeted categorical aids. And again, I'll try not to spend too much time here in the interest of time, but want to note here a couple of things. One, you see the dollar figures and for each of the recommendations that are in the governor's budget in front of the finance committee now. And those that I highlighted in yellow or gold are what would be new programs proposed by the governor. But I'll try to work through these pretty quickly. Again, with bilingual bicultural aides and educators there, I combined a couple of things there. These recommendations would do a couple of things. First year would increase the state reimbursement rate from what is about 8% reimbursement for only certain eligible districts, which has been the case for decades in Wisconsin, unfortunately, from 8% to 15%. And then in the second year, basically recraft the program consistent with what the state superintendent recommended by providing support to all districts that have English language learners in their district. And that's why you see a little bit larger bump in the second year of that program. And then a couple of new programs there. The governor is proposing providing $10 million in state categorical aid for the department to administer for energy efficiency grants specifically, which is a bit of an offshoot of something that was there under prior law. That was more of a revenue limit based piece, but this would be direct grants to districts, so it wouldn't affect the property tax. Consistent with the state superintendent's important recommendation and out of school time grants, the governor recommends, as she did, the $20 million in the second year to provide support for districts providing those out of school programs. With regard to sparsity aid, something that's been around for about 12, 15 years, certainly something the governor is very familiar with from his time, both as state superintendent and deputy state superintendent at DPI, is to recommend providing a couple of things. One, fully funding the program. This is one that's very oddly, the legislature actually reduced a little funding last go around. And then also providing support at a little lower level, all districts that are sparse. Right now, the category here is, I believe the stipulation is you have to be under 746 students. That's been around a while. This would provide support to all districts above and beyond that in both years of the biennium, regardless of their overall size, as long as they met the sparsity criteria for kids per square mile. School library aids, I mentioned those earlier. This is really just a reestimate of what districts would receive from the Board of Commissioners of Public Lands. The governor's always been a strong supporter of nutrition funding in districts. And here he's got recommendations related to school breakfast aids, consistent with the state superintendent to get to 15 cents, which is in state law, by the way. And then a new program that would provide supplemental nutrition aids that would support districts to provide directly be reimbursed by the state for those students who qualify under the reduced price lunch criteria. The governor is also recommending, which is primarily for rural districts, increased support for high-cost transportation for those districts that have the largest overall transportation costs on a per pupil basis, or just generally overall. The governor's also recommending, consistent with the state superintendent, consistent with what he proposed in the past, a driver education aid reimbursement program that had been something of the sort had been in place some years ago. In the second year, some reimbursement for open enrollment transportation for economically disadvantaged students who are transported by their parents or guardians. The governor has a new recommendation for computer science grants for educators and others to look into in the second year of the biennium. One that's also got a little bit of an attention in the media as well. The governor, consistent with the recommendations that he's heard from others, has proposing using tribal gaming revenues. That's why it says PR there. That means program revenue. Grants for those districts that choose to change their mascots and logos with $200,000 in each of the next 2 years to support any costs that might be incurred if districts choose to do that. And then you see the supplemental per pupil aids that I note there at the bottom would be a reduction, and that money is basically funneled into pupil aids. You kind of see a summary there. Have to share a little bit on private school choice programs. I know it's on many folks' minds out there. So we have the Wisconsin, the Racine, the Milwaukee, and special needs programs here that I'm summarizing, consistent with what the governor proposed 2 years ago. He's proposing a pause on those private school choice programs. They'll both limit costs and property tax increases, which are getting to be pretty significant in some cases, and saying, hey, let's have decision makers reevaluate how these programs affect public schools, how they affect property taxpayers, how they affect kids, and whether any reforms are needed. Consistent with what he proposed 2 years ago is to provide some property tax transparency by requiring private choice program state school aid reductions be shown on or attached to property tax bills. About 6 years ago, the legislature and former governor put in a provision under state law that you have to show, if you have a referenda, what the impact that has on your local property taxes. Well, if they show that for transparency purposes, this is, we think, just as just as reasonable, since the citizens didn't vote on this idea specifically. And then also the governor wants to more clearly define prior year attendance requirements in a public school. There have been some concerns in a few cases where there's that requirements in place now, but this would be a little bit more stringent on saying how can a student be eligible for a voucher if he or she attended a public school. Overall, for funding, the governor's recommendations are to basically be pretty consistent with the K-12 public school recommendations of 208 and 204 in the next 2 years. And again, the 208 is consistent with the public schools when you look at the per pupil aid that's also there, noting, however, this would be less than what they would be entitled to receive under current law. And when you look at it in the aggregate for these 4 programs, the governor's recommendations, it's about $53.6 million over the biennium. Under current law, it would be quite a bit more. And I would note that this number is both a reflection of both direct state GPR payments, that's primarily for the Milwaukee program, but also state aid reductions that pretty much cover a lot of the other programs for districts in Racine and around the state. A couple of things here, switching to another slide 12. When you look at the recommendations real quickly, again, the governor is recommending freezing the number of pupils in each of the choice programs I mentioned in the second year of the biennium at the first year of the biennium levels. His proposal would not affect current kids or incoming kids in the first year, because they're already applying, so that's already in play. New kids could still enter those programs when other pupils graduate or leave, and then the slots may shift between the private schools in those programs. Doesn't say that any private school gets so many slots necessarily. They would be, that would still happen. The overall cap would be from a state perspective. And then 2 important recommendations on the special needs scholarship program. And again, this program was put into place, I think 6 years ago, notably without ever a public hearing in the legislature. It got put in the legislative process. And the 2 recommendations the governor has here are basically simplifying it and making it slightly put a bit more fair. It would he proposes repealing the actual cost calculation for pupil figures for children with disabilities that attend private schools under this special needs scholarship program, and then also repeal what is in current law, which is the state reimburses 90% of those costs for students with disabilities above 19,000 already. So the governor is proposing repealing that as well in his budget immediately. A couple other ones. I'm jumping one last slide on K-12. On slide 13 here, I wanted to just note a couple of things quickly. The governor is also proposing increasing the state reimbursement rate for pupils transported over 12 miles by $10 annually. You can do that within the current appropriation. He is proposing repealing the Opportunity Schools Partnership Program that's been in place for, I think, 6 years that I don't believe anybody's really ever had been in. He's proposing repealing the truancy and abatement burglary suppression program, and also proposing eliminating the Office of Educational Opportunity at the University of Wisconsin system and its authority to authorize new independent charter schools. It's authorized already. Those current contracts would be allowed to continue until they expire, and they theoretically could go to a UW campus if they wanted. Consistent with all of his recommendations previously, he would allow the Department of Public Instruction to retain all educator license fees and not see 10% of them siphoned off to the state's general fund. And then one a newer item, he's proposing requiring the group insurance board that's loosely tied to the Department of Employee Trust Funds to conduct an actuarial study to assess the potential costs and savings that could be incurred by districts and plan participants if, and I note the if here, all districts participated in the ETF group health insurance program beginning in 2024. The governor is also proposing, just to find out, to have more information out there for everyone, establishing a task force overseen by the Office of the Commissioner of Insurance in collaboration with ETF to both develop and submit a potential implementation plan to both himself and the Finance Committee by the end of 2022. And again, these are just proposals to study and learn in terms of the details of what those overall numbers might be. The last couple slides pretty quickly here. Want to note some of the governor's other proposals, not specifically related to K-12 education, but just youth jurisdiction and sentencing changes. And real quickly, the governor is proposing some modification on the conditions under which an adult criminal court could exercise jurisdiction over a youth. He's proposing, again, consistent with what he proposed 2 years ago, in raising the minimum age of adult criminal court jurisdiction from the age of 17 to 18, and raising the minimum age of delinquency from the age of 10 to 12. He's also proposing eliminating the serious juvenile offender program under current law and creating an extended juvenile jurisdiction procedure if certain criteria are met for certain offenses. He's also proposing establishing criteria that a court must consider when sentencing a youth and creating a sentence modification procedure for youth who have committed offenses when they're under the age of 18. He's also proposing, and this will take some serious work with the legislature, after Lincoln Hills and the Copper Lake schools operated by the Department of Corrections are closed, counties would be provided with the authority to provide aftercare services for youth, and the type 2 status for youth would also be eliminated. The next slide, I note the governor is proposing with regard to youth correctional facilities. Now, under current law, current law says they're supposed to close on July 1 of 2021. Well, that's impossible for that to happen. The governor's recommendation, unfortunately, was ignored a bit last go round, and to get this process continued on. So he is proposing requiring that a youth be transferred from these schools as soon as a suitable placement that meets their needs are available. And when that would be to be determined. It would be probably a couple of years at a minimum, because you need the law to pass, and then also the ability for new facilities to be created. But the governor is recommending that after these facilities are closed, all type 1 juvenile correctional facilities would be eliminated. And accordingly, the Department of Corrections and counties would operate secured residential care centers for both children and youth, or what are sometimes known as SRCCYs. In the governor's capital budget, for which there's a meeting later this week, he recommends funding to construct a new EOC SRCCY in Milwaukee County that would provide services up to 32 youth. In addition, he recommends in his capital budget, or the building budget, if you will, also recommends additional funding to construct a new secure treatment facility attached to the existing Mendota Juvenile Treatment Center here in Madison, which will provide housing units for 30 male and 20 female youth. And then 1 year after these facilities are closed, governor's proposing eliminating any long-term placement in juvenile detention centers and the holds that they can have on youth. Last slide I wanted to mention in terms of juvenile justice reform, these relate primarily the dollars to the Department of Children and Families. The governor is proposing both reducing the number of youth requiring secure placement, as I mentioned, and making a number of investments here, which are critical. First one is $11.5 million over the Biennium to improve effective community-based services, to provide both additional statewide training and quality assurance to those caseworkers that are providing knowledge, to provide a baseline of knowledge and quality for youth justice agencies throughout Wisconsin. Secondly, to provide a new community grant program for counties to significantly elevate their case management practices and use of intensive evidence-based treatment. And thirdly, for funding for residential care, a residential care grant program for out-of-home providers. One in a congregate setting and one for more treatment foster youth setting for provider, to specifically provide intensive services, counseling, additional services on a community level for justice-involved youth who require treatment services in an out-of-home setting. Second one here is the governor's proposing creating a new sum sufficient appropriation of $10 million in each year to reimburse counties for the increased costs associated with raising the age from adjudication or adults adjudication, that is automatically now at 17 to age 18, so that 17-year-olds that were in that situation would be under the authority of counties then, as opposed to how it works now. And then, as I mentioned earlier, the governor is proposing eliminating the serious juvenile offender program in the Department of Corrections and moving responsibility for care for future young offenders to the counties. And what he's proposing here is important in authorizing the Department of Children and Families to distribute additional funding each year, not quite 20 million over the biennium, in youth aids to ensure that counties can meet the increase in services that they will be providing from the elimination of the serious juvenile offender program that's been in place in current law for a couple of decades. So that is hopefully in a quick nutshell, and clearly it is not all of the budget by a long shot, but it is a summary that I hope is helpful to everyone here today. Big picture from both a K-12 education perspective for the most part, but a little bit here also on this, some of the governor's proposals on juvenile justice reform that are under consideration in the legislature, along with all the other items in the legislature. And one other note I wanted to provide here, I think the next item that will be coming up with in terms of a summary, the governor's budget's out there in terms of the summary documentation, but will be the Legislative Fiscal Bureau. Director Lang will have a summary of the budget, which will be quite lengthy, and that will be something that the legislature, specifically the Joint Committee on Finance, will be operating from, that summarizes the governor's proposals, the intent behind them as they work through that process ahead. And one other thing I did want to add from a summary perspective, whereas in the last year, obviously we've all been through unprecedented times that none of us perhaps could have predicted. And certainly one of the things amidst that, which pale in comparison, I will humbly note, to the health crises so many have faced, is in terms of the state's fiscal situation. And it's not a whole lot different in some ways from what other states we are understanding of have been experiencing. And that is to say that, and I say this with just straight up, that Wisconsin does have one of the largest surpluses it's ever seen, ending the current biennium. In terms of that dollar figure, we don't know exactly what it's going to be, and it's a little bit more complex this time because the governor signed some legislation that's affected that after he introduced his budget. But I would note with Director Lang's Legislative Fiscal Bureau estimated an ending balance a couple of months ago of about $1.8 billion for the state of Wisconsin at the end of this fiscal year, at the end of this biennium, which is far larger than any of us would have expected a number of months ago, particularly in any month for the most part in 2020. That number might be a little bit less right now, but we're obviously taking a close look at this. But I really want to note that in terms of the projections, in terms of state resources available for whatever purpose going forward, whether they're in education or healthcare or small businesses or support in agriculture, any other field, that the state's probably ending with as strong a balance as it ever has had. In addition to that, the state's budget stabilization fund is at a record level as well. So that is separate monies that have been set aside, for the most part, are automatically set aside, and that's been occurring in the last couple of budgets as well. And Director Lang's most recent revenue estimate that they put out, the Legislative Fiscal Bureau, in late January, projected additional dollars there too. So the issue of dollars not being available depends on one's perspective. And certainly one significant piece I just want to also add to this discussion for consideration is you may have seen this, and it is so critical. The governor has proposed once again that the state, along with the 38 other states in the United States, adopt Medicaid expansion to provide more affordable quality health care to over 90,000 individuals right now. Doing so is not only the right thing to do, clearly from a health perspective, it's clearly the right thing to do. States red and blue across the country have done it. We're one of the few, I think we're one of the only ones left in the Midwest that have not chosen to do that. But most recently, and this is after the governor's budget had come out, the Legislative Fiscal Bureau has estimated, and we were aware of this too, that doing so would save the state in terms of GPR dollars over $1.6 billion over the biennium. It's a little bit of a temporary piece in the next 2 years, but this is legislation that President Biden signed just the other day that also has that piece of it as part of the much broader American Rescue Act. But I really want to note the importance of this. It just makes sense to do. It's smart policy, et cetera, from a healthcare perspective. But I can't understate the importance of it from a fiscal perspective. And clearly, it's something that we hope is under consideration this go round more so than it was in the last time. So with that, I'm happy to touch base on any questions and such. And Heather, thank you once again.
Thank you, Brian. We do have some questions for you, and I will just kick them off by saying it strikes me from listening to your presentation that Wisconsin hasn't been in a position to put forward such an excellent budget in quite a long time. And now that we are, it couldn't be more critical to try to use this moment to close some of the substantial gaps facing our kids in schools. So thank you to you and your team, and thank you to the governor for giving us a budget that so clearly is aligned with meeting the needs of our kids in their public schools. There is much to champion here, and I hope that all who are listening are finding ways that they can connect these budget priorities to the stories that they need to tell from their own districts and communities, so that we can really bring them to life when we demonstrate why these measures are so important to our kids in their schools. Our first question, Brian, appears to be coming from whom I guess is maybe John Humphreys from Association for Equity and Funding. Is that you, John? John's asking about the revenue limit increases in the last budget that
Mhm.
showed that even though even though the revenue limit increased, the number of districts that received over $12,000 per pupil doubled, and wondered if this proposal raises the low districts without also raising the ceiling.
This proposal, and I'm just looking, I have the slide up, John and Heather, from slide 6, I think it is, at the bottom.
Mm-hmm.
I hope I'm answering this correctly. That number goes up or has gone up periodically and by different thresholds over time. The current law is 10,000. I don't know immediately how many districts have chosen to take advantage of it this year. But if you assume a district did, what this would say to a district that did, or quite honestly that didn't, that they can go, if the governor's recommendation is approved, and you got to do this in tandem with the first item in this on this page. If you're at 10,000 this year, and the legislature agreed to all of these proposals, you would get to go to 10,200 automatically with the governor's additional $200. This would provide a district in that situation with the opportunity to increase by another 50, if that makes sense, going from 10,000 to 10,200 with the per pupil adjustment that would be, so to speak, automatic. This would allow them to go up by another $50 per pupil if they chose to do so in year 1. Similarly, that would go in year 2 as well. It also provides a district with the flexibility, if they chose not to go up to this number in year 1, it would still allow them to do so in year 2 to get to 10,500 by the end of the biennium without having to go to referendum.
Did that answer your question, John? All right, let's move on to the next question in our thread, which I think is one that we have probably heard more than any other as well, Brian, which is, what can we really do to make sure that some of these most critical budget priorities get through the joint finance process? And do you have any inclination of, you know, what has the most bipartisan support and what is maybe least likely to get through?
I'll do my best on this. I guess at the point I'd make on the first piece on behalf of the governor, and he said this more than once to when he speaks with folks and when he and I chat and such. I think really is, and first of all, again, the support from WPN has been tremendous. But I think it's that opportunity to touch base with the members of the committee and their staff, however you best see fit, whether it's through a virtual meeting like this, through a phone call, through an old-fashioned letter, through an email, and having those contacts. And then also, and I know that's not new to anyone, but I think the other part is if there are stories to tell in your local districts that you're dealing with, and some of the challenges that you continue to face, both particularly as they may have related to the pandemic or not. But clearly, I think those local stories are so important. Directly with their local legislators for whom represent you, and the children in your school district, and that may be across legislators in some cases. But I think that's a really important piece, and I know so many people in this organization have done that It's been much appreciated. I think as I look back to 2 years ago, certainly while there are certainly some, many of the same folks there, there are some new folks. And quite honestly, in both cases on the finance committee, you have two new co-chairs that are different than who were there before. Now, both co-chairs here were on the committee last year. And I would note in Senator Markline's case, in particular, he was on the Blue Ribbon Commission that I noted earlier on in 2017 and 18. When I think about proposals that went through last time, I mean, this is I'll try not to go too long. Certainly the governor recommended about 600 million in general aid. I think the number ended up about being 300 and some odd million. The governor recommended 200 and 204 in revenue limits, and I think they ended up at 175 and 179. So there was progress there. Funding for children with disabilities, as I mentioned earlier, the governor had much larger proposals. And the committee, albeit, did move the needle a little, but not a whole lot. Same for mental health categorical aids as well. Other things that were successful, I mentioned the low revenue ceiling was successful there in terms of moving the needle. Some of the other categorical aids, though, not so much. I think of those on that broader page I had here. When I'm thinking back here and this page that I'm looking at, very few of them moved at all. And there's a couple of these that are new, perhaps, but for the most part, there wasn't a lot of movement in some of the other ones, particularly for English learners and nutrition and even sparsity aid, a number of programs that had some bipartisan support and have had bipartisan support over the years. So I say that in the broader sense, I think there was some movement on the transportation aid side, again, albeit not as much as the governor had recommended. So there were some things that moved, but most certainly were not at the levels he recommended. And then more broadly on the 2/3 funding commitment, again, it seemed like one house was pretty interested in it, even though they didn't ended up really getting there in the end, and were off by quite a bit.
So Brian, we have a couple of questions on the theme of how we can afford these nice things. Julie is wondering who controls how the surplus or the rainy day fund is spent and how does that work? And then
Sure.
a kind of related question was, can you please give us that list again of areas that are in the budget that allow us to pay for what the increases the governor has proposed?
Okay, a couple of things, and I say it's in the aggregate. I mentioned the Medicaid expansion, broadly speaking, and that again is a lot of the recommendations the governor's made with regard to healthcare and provider increases and all the things that are so critical in the programs that the Department of Health Services runs. A lot of the savings there that the governor's presumed are going into those programs. And that was about, I think we said that's like $634 million. That's what's budgeted there for savings there. Again, with what the president signed the other day, if Wisconsin would adopt that, this is not in the governor's budget. That would save another $1 billion in terms of overall general purpose revenues, which again, can go anywhere. So I note I can't understate the importance of that above and beyond what's already in the governor's budget. And quite honestly, in terms of the governor's budget, yes. What was one of the pieces? Oh, budget stabilization fund. The governor does not recommend spending anything from that. That is not part of the mix, if you will. He just leaves that be. But overall, he's got some other things in there. And quite honestly, I'll just raise it. I mean, in terms of on the tax side, on the enhancers, the governor's recommending that the state adopt the IRC or the Internal Revenue Service Code for federal tax law changes. And I would just note that the governor's recommendations are to adopt, and this sounds a little odd, but to adopt the former president's Tax Cut and Jobs Act that former President Trump proposed and adopted and signed into law in 2017. Well, to date, the legislature's chosen not to adopt all those changes. They like to seem to adopt them for certain times, but not others. That alone would bring in another $500 million and conform our tax code to that of the federal government. So that's a proposal that the governor has there that also would bring in additional revenues to the state. And the governor also has, some other proposals to bring in additional revenues for high income earners on the capital gains front. Only those above 400,000 would be affected. in income annually. So he proposes bringing in some additional revenues in his budget. And again, I would also note, though, coming back to what I mentioned earlier, really starting out in such a strong position comparatively. Again, whether it's $1.6 billion, $1.7 billion, $1.8 billion, that's our starting point. And yes, in all honesty, and there's been articles on this, the governor is recommending using a good majority of that existing surplus, because the time is now. The needs are significant, and the needs aren't necessarily, and while they're certainly going to be there in 22, 23, the governor's recommendations are heavily in 21, 22, recognizing in the best case scenario that we have a budget by July 1 that he can sign that gets those monies from the state's perspective, the state's investments, and what the state can do going forward right away.
Well, Brian, we couldn't agree more that it is critically important to invest in closing our gaps and making sure that we put forward a budget that does more than just maintain the status quo, but really works to invest in closing those gaps between have and have not kids around the state.
Right.
Thank you for giving us a budget we can champion this year and that we can cheer for. We look forward to telling our stories that connect to the many facts that we learned today at the budget hearings and beyond. And we will make this recording available on our website at wisconsonnetwork.org/budget to anyone who wants to see it again or share it. I wish we had time to go through all of the other questions that came through in the chat, but we are out of time. So thank you so much, Brian, for your time today. And thanks to everyone who joined us. We hope you all have a great afternoon, and we will see you on Thursday at our next budget action workshop, where we'll talk about how we can really make that testimony shine.
Heather, thank you. And thank you everyone for taking the time to be part of this hour that is just a great thing to be able to share with everyone here. So.